Greninja, Sceptile, Infernape. These are just a few of the most iconic and beloved starter Pokemon in the entire franchise. But just who is the best of the best? At the beginning of every region, the first thing we must do is make a decision that will greatly affect all of our playthroughs. Which starter Pokemon will you be choosing? These starter Pokemon are more often than not the Pokemon we spend the most time with on our playthroughs. Oftentimes, they are also the most powerful and over-leveled Pokemon on each of our teams. But today, we're going to be looking at each and every starter trio from each region and ranking them from worst to best. Now, these rankings will not just be based on their final forms, but also their first, second, third, as well as alternate forms if they have them. But before we get started, let me just say, this is only my opinion, guys. Be sure to drop your starter trio rankings in the comment section below. And also, these selections will only be based on the main starter trio from each respective regions. So that means no Pikachu, Eevee, Umbreon, Espeon, and also a no to the Hisuian starters, and that's because they're essentially just new forms to starters that we've already gotten. I will, however, include Hisuian forms when discussing their base forms. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Coming in dead last and taking the title of the worst regional starter trio is the Unova starters. Oh man, where do I begin with this trio from Unova? I guess I'll start with their first forms. And honestly, looking at them, they aren't all that bad. They're actually pretty cute. I mean, I honestly can't find much of a problem with any of these, except for Oshawott maybe being a little too similar to Piplup, and I also kind of found Ash's Oshawott to be really annoying in the anime. But besides that, they're all solid. The middle stages are actually pretty alright too. I think Duat is one of the best middle stage starters in Pokemon history. It doesn't look like one of those weird and ugly middle stagers, and it's actually really, really solid. Pignite, I'm not a big fan of. I, like many, would have preferred if he didn't get up on two legs and would have just stayed on all fours. Also, I'm not a big fan of him gaining that fighting type. Then there's Servine, who falls right in the middle for me. Not too bad, but also not great. Just good. And for a middle stage, that's okay. So far, I've said a lot of positive things, so you might be thinking, then how can the Unova starters be in dead last if all he said is good things? Well, they're in last because they absolutely dropped the ball on their final forms. Let's start off with Samurott. Bruh, it's just brutal the way they butchered this line. They were building up this line to be some awesome water-based samurai, but Samurott simply doesn't do a good job of pulling it off. Meanwhile, his stats are just straight up bad. It doesn't know if it wants to be a physical or special attacker, and its speed stat is too low to be worth anything. This is also the only starter where I prefer the Hisuian form to the base form. Hisuian Samurott is actually awesome. It's got a much better typing, slightly better distributed stats, and the move Ceaseless Edge is amazing. Now for the worst of the worst. Emboar. Oh man, Emboar. The Pokemon Company really just set you up for failure, didn't they? Coming right off the heels of two of the coolest fire types ever, who were also fire and fighting types. You just simply couldn't compete with them. Well, I will admit, you hit pretty hard in battle. It just seems like you will never be loved by almost anyone. Like seriously, I've been around the Pokemon community for almost a decade now, and I have never, ever heard anyone claim that Emboar is their favorite starter. Contrary to popular belief though, I actually think Serperior is a pretty dang good starter. While it's definitely not great, it is most certainly the best of the Unova 3. The design might be a bit bland, and I mean the whole Snivy line is as it just gets longer and loses arms. But in battle, it's been a beast ever since it unlocked its hidden ability. Mix that in with Leaf Storm, along with Glare and Substitute, and this Pokemon's actually very powerful and quite fun to use. So the final forms of these starters are weighed the most in this ranking because they're the most important of them all. It's the form that you will have the longest, from about level 36 all the way up to level 100. But overall, I think the reason why the Unova trio is so hated is because of how boring they are. Think about it, across all of Pokemon media, when have the Unova starters ever gotten any special attention? No powered up forms, no major roles in the anime, not even any real signature moves. It's kinda sad how these guys have been treated. Well, let's move on. Coming in at 8th is the Galarian starters. Now, this is another starter group that totally dropped the ball as they evolve. I mean, looking at all the first forms, they're all actually great and have a ton of personality. Scorbunny is the energetic little fire rabbit, Grookey is the cute and curious monkey, and Sobble is a scared baby lizard. Overall, they're pretty cute and I dig them. Their middle evolutions are all pretty good too. Raboot just looks awesome. He's a sick Akatsuki ninja, parka-wearing beast. Drizzile is pretty cool too, and a pretty natural-looking middle-stage water Pokemon. And Thwackey is certainly a Pokemon too. But once again, Pokemon just drops the ball with these Mon's final forms. Rillaboom, Cinderace, and Inteleon are all just a straight-up bad trio. In my opinion, what makes these Pokemon so bad is just they're too gimmicky. It seems like since Generation 6, Pokemon has been very adamant about giving each starter Pokemon some major characteristic or quirk to base themselves around. When you look back on the starters of old, they used to be based on simple things, like a dragon or a salamander. But now you want to base starters on soccer players? It just comes off as a bit weird to me and not all that natural. Alright, well let's talk about each starter now. Rillaboom is probably my favorite of the bunch. The design itself is pretty solid. Most monkey Pokemon are often a big hit, and this one does a pretty good job overall. It had a very underrated role in the anime as Leon's most overpowered Pokemon. This thing was kicking names and taking butt in the Masters 8. It is most certainly the best starter here. Next, we've got Cinderace. It's probably the most impressive here when it comes to battling prowess. Both Libero and Court Change are really great things unique to Cinderace, and its move pool is similarly impressive. Finally is Inteleon. Oh boy, Inteleon. You just straight up suck in about every way possible. Inteleon's just got such a weird build and body shape, it makes me uncomfortable to look at. Plus, why would you want to base a Pokemon around James Bond? Taking 7th place on today's ranking is the Paldea starters. Now, honestly, a lot of things said about the Galarian starters is applicable here with the Paldea starters. But obviously, I view them to be slightly better, hence the slightly higher ranking. And here's why. Beginning with the original first form starters, these guys again all rock. Sprigatito, Fuecoco, and Quaxly are all adorable. The internet absolutely blew up when these guys were revealed to us, and it seemed like they were all unanimously loved, especially Fuecoco and Quaxly. I honestly see no problems with these first stages at all. Then we got the second stages, and again, these guys are all pretty solid. The second stages of starter Pokemon are never going to be the greatest thing ever, because they aren't meant to be. But this trio's very well balanced. Florigato's great, Crocolore's solid, and Quaxwell is, well, not all that good. But that's okay. Finally, we have the final forms, and boy are these three all over the place. Quaquaval is just a weird design in my opinion. Everyone and their mother was hoping Quaxly's final form would end up being some awesome and intimidating pirate, but instead we got the exact opposite. But I can't deny how impressive Quaquaval is in battle. Actually, all three of these starters are incredibly OP. I enjoy using Quaquaval in battle because of its ability to snowball through opposing teams. With Aqua Step boosting speed and Moxie boosting attack, throw on the Water Terra and this thing is a straight menace. Now we got Meowscarada, who is solid overall. I don't hate it, but I also don't love it. It seems to be a bit over-designed in my opinion, but there's no denying how versatile this thing is in battle. With Protean and Terra, your opponent has no idea of what typing you're really gonna be. And then finally, we've got Skeledirge, who upon first reveal, I was not a big fan of. I'm not totally sure as to why, but I just did not like this croc. But over the past year, it has certainly grown on me, and I could proudly say it is now my favorite Paldean starter. The whole line is honestly pretty amazing. Fuecoco is obviously as good as it gets, Crocolore is pretty cool, and Skeledirge is just epic. The big highlight of Skeledirge is his battling prowess. This is one thick croc who can tank hits, and thanks to its unaware ability, it laughs in the face of stat boosters. Its signature move Torch Song also allows it to sweep opponents. Overall, I'm indifferent about this trio as a whole. The biggest problem is their designs. They all just come off as a bit too much to me. Sometimes there's a real beauty and simplicity, and that's definitely missed here. Still a pretty cool trio all the same. Now, coming in 6th place is none other than the Johto starters. Sorry guys, but nostalgia will not be blinding me today. The Johto starters are solid, but of course, they are just a bit bland. It doesn't help them that they're sandwiched between two regions with amazing starter trios, so they kinda just look bad by relation. Still though, there's a lot of good to be found from this trio. Let's begin with their first forms. This is another trio that has all three first forms pull off that cute gimmick perfectly. The second forms, though, are where the boringness begins. They're all kinda just the same as their first forms, but slightly bigger. The only one with some creativity to its evolution is Croconaw. And actually, I like Croconaw so much, he just so happens to be my favorite middle stage water starter. I just love his caveman little vibe he's got going on, and kinda wish they stuck with it in its final form. And speaking of final forms, they're good. Just good. I'll get my least favorite out of the way first. Meganium. We all saw it coming. And to many, it's one of the worst starters ever. There's absolutely no creativity to its design. It really isn't all that good in battle, and it's received very little time in the spotlight. I guess its biggest role was in Pokemon Snap, which I'll admit it actually looked really pretty here. But honestly, just about every other grass starter outclasses it. Now Typhlosion and Feraligatr are both cool. I dig both their styles. They're both pretty awesome looking, and I've enjoyed using them both in games and battle. Plus, Feraligatr has undoubtedly the greatest back sprite ever back in Gen 3. And Typhlosion is great too. While it may have a bit less versatility than Feraligatr, you still can't go wrong with it. However, the years have not been kind to our boy Typhlosion. Eruption is still a great move to have on it, but I mean, that's honestly about it. And what may just be worse of all, its 3D model. He went from one of the most epic sprites in all of Pokemon to, And I guess now I should talk about Hisuian Typhlosion. I'm fine with him. He's the middle of the pack for me as far as Hisuian starters. The Ghost type was a nice addition though. As I look at the Johto starters, I can't help but feel as if they're just missing that it factor that could make them special. It could be because they're all just monotypes. Also, it could just be that they've never really had any major roles in the anime or other Pokemon media. Just kinda a mid-trio overall. Now we move into the top 5, beginning with the starter trio from Kalos. Now, if you asked me 4 years ago what I thought about this trio, I would have said something like, oh, everyone but Greninja sucks. And I'm sure I wasn't the only Pokemon fan that thought that. I mean, for almost 5 straight years, Greninja was jammed down our throats at every turn, but now that we've gotten a bit of space from the water starter, I can definitely say that the others have grown on me. Let's begin with Fennekin. Now, Fennekin is definitely my favorite first form of the Kalosian starters. I remember back in the day when the first forms got revealed. I was all in on this little web browser. But as it evolved, it did the opposite of glow up. I can't help but feel as if the magician gimmick could have been pulled off a bit better here. The design is just brutal, and those ear hair things are kinda gross. However, Delphox is pretty decent in battle, so it's not all that bad. Now we've got Chespin, Quilladin, and Chestnut. And oh boy, this is one crazy line. It starts as an adorable little chipmunk, then becomes a round boy, then becomes, I'm not exactly sure what Chestnut is supposed to be. Some sort of chipmunk knight warrior thing? And while its design might not be a home run, I gotta admit that Chestnut has grown on me in recent years. It's gotten much better in battle, thanks to moves like Trailblaze, Iron Defense, and the ability to tear it into something like Pure Fighting or the Steel type. And it was pretty cool to see Alon use a Chestnut in Pokemon Journeys. Overall, this line's pretty good in my opinion. Now it's time to talk about the Froakie line. And call me basic or unoriginal, but I absolutely adore Greninja. I cannot understate the importance of Greninja to the Pokemon franchise. This ninja frog is responsible for bringing so many old fans, including myself, back into Pokemon. I'd argue that Greninja is the biggest reason for the mid-2010s Pokemon Renaissance. I mean, even Masahiro Sakurai knew this thing was going to be a fan favorite, as he chose to add him to Smash Bros. Before the X and Y games were even released. Of course, the biggest reason I and many others are such big Greninja fans is because of his leading role in the Pokemon XYZ anime. At the time, Ash's Greninja carried him farther than he'd ever been in any previous regional league. Sure, he came up a bit short, but we don't really talk about that. Even after Greninja took that major L, he still remains one of mine and many others' favorite Pokemon ever. He also went on to win a competition in 2020 and was voted the most popular Pokemon. So yeah, Greninja's a major icon in Pokemon history, right up there with the likes of Mewtwo, Pikachu, and even Lucario. So as a whole, I'd say this trio is great and has aged pretty gracefully. I'd love to see Delphox and Chestnut receive some alternate forms similar to the Ash Greninja form. Who knows, maybe we'll get something like this in the eventual X and Y remakes. Coming in strong at 4th place is the trio of the 4th generation. Yup, it's the Sinnoh starters. Just an overall great group, and you can't go wrong with any of them. I know I've used all 3 different lines in different playthroughs from the Sinnoh region, and I've had great and fun experiences with them all. For this entry, let's begin with the bad. The biggest issue with this trio is kinda weird, because it's not really a fault of any of these Pokemon themselves, but a fault of every other Pokemon in the game. If you've ever played through the base Diamond and Pearl games, you probably already know what I'm talking about. The biggest problem is the lack of fire types actually available in Sinnoh. So if you don't choose Chimchar and then by extension Infernape, then the only other fire type you can use in a playthrough is Ponyta. I know for me, when I play, I always try to build a fire, water, and grass core, and this is very hard to do in these games because, there's only really 2 options. But besides that, there's really no cons to this trio. The first stage forms are all very cute, and the second stages are all solid. Well, except you. And then their final stages are all just epic. Let's go down the line, shall we? We've got the World Turtle Pokemon based on Akupara, then we've got the Emperor Penguin Pokemon based on Napoleon, and then you've got the Flaming Monkey based on Sun Wukong, and by extension, Goku. It's also worth noting that this was the first time all 3 starters had 2 typings, which is always good. Then meanwhile in the anime, their roles varied. Torterra certainly got the short end of the stick here. Ash had a Turtwig that was great towards the beginning of the DP anime, but then as the series progressed, and as Turtwig evolved, he became a first-class jobber. Meanwhile, the Empoleon line got some decent time in the spotlight. Empoleon was used by Barry as his hard-hitting ace, but Piplup was the real star of this line. Dawns was adorable, unforgettable, and appeared in just about every episode of the DP series. But we all know who stole the show here. It was Ash's Infernape, that went through arguably the best arc in anime history. Starting off as a weak Chimchar that was deemed unworthy of Paul's team, to ultimately being the blaze-using monster that would go on to defeat Paul and earn his revenge. This scene here still gives me goosebumps after all these years. Overall, I really like this trio. I do wish they got a bit more love from Pokemon recently though. I can't help but feel as if the ball was dropped on giving them Gigantamax forms. But I guess we can blame BDSP for being the worst games ever conceived. Nevertheless, this trio is great. So taking the bronze medal on today's ranking is none other than the original starters from Kanto. So many memories with these 3. Let's begin this entry with a deep rewind to a time before all the Mega Forms and Gigantamaxes. Now, Fire Red was my first ever Pokemon game, and as I began my journey, I was stuck with the decision, Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle. I decided to go with Charmander, because it was orange, and so was that big awesome dragon on the cover of my game, so I figured Charmander would eventually evolve into that. So yes, Charmander was my first ever starter Pokemon, and because of that, I will always have a soft spot in my heart for it. I know many other Pokemon players have a similar experience to me with all these Kanto starters, and not just Charmander. I mean, these 3 starters played a major role in turning Pokemon into the worldwide phenomenon that it is today. All 3 of these starters are amazing for any Kanto playthrough, especially Bulbasaur, which can carry you through most of the early game with ease. Ash had all 3 Kanto starters to begin his journey, and they were all solid, especially his Charizard, who went through a really solid arc and began that tragic backstory cliche. The only real problem I have with these starters is how much they've been jammed down our throats. I mean, let's be honest, did they all really need Gigantamax forms? It should have gone to someone more deserving, like the Johto starters. I have no problems with their Megas though. They're all great, make them better, and all are designed pretty well. But we've all just seen these 3 way too much, especially Charizard. I mean, first we've got Alon with his Charizard in Gen 6, but then did we really have to get Leon with his Charizard in Gen 8? I'm a huge Charizard fanboy, and even I found that to be a bit tiresome. Overall though, this trio from Kanto is simply iconic, and it's totally understandable as to why they're so loved. Taking the penultimate spot on today's list is the Alolan starters. I remember when these mons first got revealed to us, and they made me so excited to journey to the new Alola region. As I look at their first forms, they all just exude personality and charm. We've got Poplio, which just seems to be a fun Pokemon. Then there's Litten, who seems to just be annoyed and wants to be left alone. and I guess that's kinda how real cats are. And finally, we've got Rowlet. Their middle stage forms are not all that great, but whatever, they don't really need to be. And then, their final stages are all just epic. First up, we've got Decidueye, which is just one absolutely sick design. The Ghost Archer Owl? What a fun and unique concept. I am not such a big fan of Hisui and Decidueye though. The typing and stats just don't work that well on it, even though Triple Arrows is a pretty great move. Incineroar is another epic mon. A flaming wrestling cat is kind of an insane design choice, but it's pulled off relatively well here. Incineroar also might just be the most OP Pokemon of all time, at least when it comes to the VGC competitive. And Ash's Incineroar in the anime had a great storyline, going from the poor orphan little kitty to the strongest Pokemon in all of Alola. What a sick cat. Then finally is Primarina. And Primarina, I'll admit, you kinda got the short end of the stick here. Still, I appreciate the more feminine design it has. And in battle, this thing is certainly impressive. Its typing of Water and Fairy is a great combo. It's got so much coverage, solid stats, and a great Z-move. Mix in a really solid design, and Primarina may just be one of the most underrated starters ever. Now this trio is undoubtedly the best trio we've gotten in a long while. They all have epic and awesome Z-moves that are basically auto OHKO nuke buttons. And all the gimmicks are pulled off really well, and they're all amazing in-game. But coming in first, you know 'em, you love 'em, the Hoenn starters. Yup, back in Gen 3 was the one and only time where all three starters were absolutely perfect. In every single way, these three mons are the definition of peak. Let's begin with the Torchic line. Now, Torchic's just straight up adorable. Easily one of the cutest starters we've ever gotten. There's also some insane lore behind the gender differences of a Torchic. If you know, you know. Then there's Combustion. Then finally, we have Blaziken. One of the coolest Pokemon ever, and easily the best firefighting type in all of Pokemon. Yeah, I said it! This Pokemon burst onto the scene in the Johto anime by way of Harrison's Ace, who, let me just tell you, was strong enough to take down Ash's Charizard. So right there, that automatically scores you a ton of points on the cool meter. I mean, every single Blaziken in the anime has been awesome. Maze? Chad. Harrison's? Chad. Blaziken Mass? Mega Chad. Oh yeah, and speaking of Megas, Blaziken's is like one of the most OP ever. Now let's talk Mudkips. I heard you like them. Yes, iconic memes aside, Mudkip is awesome. You can just tell he stands on his business. Then we've got Marshtomp, another kinda awkward middle stage. But then we've got Swampert, a Pokemon that many believe to be the strongest starter in Pokemon history. And rightfully so. We all know that you can sweep through the entire Hoenn region with just this mon. Swampert's Mega is also body goals. I guarantee this thing can bench press an entire Wailord. Then finally is the Trico line. Trico's design is solid, not really all that cute, but just a solid first stager. Then Grovyle takes it to a whole nother level. This is a Pokemon that made many fans say that Grovyle is the best middle stage in all of Pokemon. And honestly, it's me. I'm many fans. This dude rocks. Plus he had an epic and emotional role in the Mystery Dungeon game. And then finally is my favorite Pokemon of all time, Sceptile. Yeah, for 2 generations, the Grass-type starter was kind of an afterthought when compared to the likes of the Fire and Water starters. Then Sceptile hit the scene and basically said, I'm him. And then we got like the coolest Pokemon ever. In my Emerald copy, Sceptile was the first Pokemon I ever got to the prestigious level 100, and he basically swept through all of Hoenn with just a Leaf Blade. My love for Sceptile grew to a whole nother level with Ash Ketchum's Sceptile in the anime. He was just the epitome of cool. It's undoubtedly one of Ash's best Pokemon ever. Sceptile's Mega is pretty solid too. It adds the Dragon typing, which is also great, and its tail grows like crazy. Overall, with the Hoenn Trinity here, you just can't go wrong with any of them. They're just perfect. Well guys, that's gonna do it for today's video. This was a long one, but it was a ton of fun. I'm curious to hear what you guys think of my rankings and what changes you would make. Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. Also, check out this video right here to see what I think would be Ash Ketchum's ultimate Pokemon team.